All right, everyone, buckle up, because today's story is one of those moments where global politics suddenly flips upside down and the world goes, wait, did that really just happen? So here's the deal. Last week, the Trump administration dropped a political earthquake, a 28-point ceasefire proposal for the Russia-Ukraine war. And this wasn't just any proposal. This was a plan that demanded Ukraine give up territory, basically telling Kyiv, look, hand over some of your land, accept the reality on the ground, and let's wrap this war up. Well, as you can imagine, the reaction wasn't subtle. The world pretty much exploded. Today we're going deep into how the world reacted, why Trump's team is trying to push this, what it would mean if the plan actually went through, how it could reshape America's role in the world, and finally, why Trump may not actually expect this plan to pass the way it's written, and how it fits into his classic negotiating style. Let's get into it. The moment the Trump administration released the outline, the reactions started flying in from every direction. Kyiv, Moscow, Brussels, Berlin, London, and even Washington itself. And the tone ranged from stunned to furious to cautiously pleased, depending on which side you were listening to. Let's walk through the main reactions because they set the stage for everything we'll analyze later. Ukraine's reaction was exactly what you'd expect, maybe even stronger. For them, this wasn't a peace plan. This was an attempt to force major concessions at gunpoint. Ukrainian officials said things like, "This rewards aggression. No democratic nation should be asked to give up sovereign land. This is not peace. This is surrender." And honestly, from their perspective, that's not an exaggeration, because if you're Ukraine, the moment you sign away land under military pressure, land Russia took by force, you're basically telling every future invader, if you invade us long enough, eventually the world will push us to give you what you want. That's why Kyiv immediately rejected it. There was a mix of anger and deep disappointment, because for the past few years, the United States was Ukraine's #1 supporter. The country that had its back when Russia invaded. The country that helped arm its defenses. The country that insisted borders can't be changed by force. And now, suddenly, Washington is saying, actually, maybe they can. That's more than policy. That cuts to the heart of national survival. Let's talk about Moscow. Russia didn't officially say, "We love it," because diplomacy rarely works that way. But they didn't have to. Their reaction told you everything you needed to know. They welcomed it, politely, calmly, in that, yes, well, we're open to peace as long as peace includes what we already stole kind of way. Of course they like the plan. It gives them land without having to earn it militarily. It validates their presence. It signals a West is getting tired. From Russia's perspective, this is perfect, because a plan that forces Ukraine to give up territory does two things they've wanted all along. One, it weakens Ukraine permanently. A smaller Ukraine is a weaker Ukraine. Two, it signals the US is backing off. A disengaging America makes Europe more vulnerable. And let's be honest, if the US shows that invading a neighbor and holding out long enough eventually leads to diplomatic rewards, why wouldn't Russia consider doing it again? Whether that's in Ukraine or somewhere else along its borders. We'll come back to that later, because that's one of the biggest long-term consequences of this entire plan. Europe was not happy. Countries like Poland, the Baltic states, Germany, and the UK reacted with varying levels of shock and concern. Why? Because if America pulls back on Ukraine, Europe becomes Russia's next political target, if not military one. Poland and the Baltics were particularly blunt. This sets a dangerous precedent. Appeasement will only invite further aggression. If Ukraine is forced to surrender, no border in Europe is safe. European governments have been terrified of this scenario since the first Russian tank crossed into Ukraine in 2022. Because to them, Ukraine isn't just Ukraine. Ukraine is the buffer zone between them and Moscow, the front line of European security. So when the US signals it's stepping away from that fight, Europe hears, you're on your own. And trust me, That is their worst nightmare. Outside of Europe, most of the democratic world reacted with some variation of, "This rewards aggression. This undermines international law. This changes the global order in a way that benefits authoritarian states." Countries in Asia in particular, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, are watching closely. They live next to powerful, nuclear-armed neighbors who have territorial ambitions of their own. If Russia gets rewarded for invading Ukraine, what lesson does that send to Beijing about Taiwan, or to North Korea about South Korea, or to Iran about the Middle East? That's why global reactions were overwhelmingly negative. Now let's get into the heart of it, and this is the part you asked about explicitly. Why would the Trump administration roll out a plan this dramatic, this controversial, and this likely to blow up in their faces? To understand that, we need to look at a few strategic, political, and ideological factors, all of which overlap. Let's break them down. 1. Trump sees the war as a cost, not a cause. At its core, Trump's worldview is transactional. He sees Ukraine not as a moral struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, but as a financial sinkhole, a conflict where the U.S. has spent tens of billions of dollars with no clear end in sight. From his perspective, America has spent enough. America shouldn't be the world's ATM. The U.S. shouldn't keep funding a war that doesn't directly benefit Americans. Whether you agree with that perspective or not, it's the lens he uses. So, the 28-point plan is, in many ways, a reflection of Trump's instinct to cut losses quickly, even if the solution isn't perfect, even if it creates controversy. 2. Trump genuinely believes Europe should carry more weight. This is one of the most consistent parts of Trump's foreign policy worldview, going back years, long before the Ukraine war even began. He has always argued, Europe relies too heavily on American protection. NATO countries don't spend enough on defense. The U.S. ends up footing the bill for European security. And that's unfair to American taxpayers. So when Trump's team looks at Ukraine, they see a European problem. They see a war happening on Europe's doorstep. And yet Europe still depends on the U.S. more than itself. So pushing a rapid peace plan that ends America's biggest financial burden in Europe fits perfectly into what Trump's been preaching for years. 3. Trump views geopolitics as deal-making. This is something critics sometimes misunderstand about Trump. To Trump, every conflict is negotiable. Every war is a deal waiting to be made. Every stalemate is something you can break by offering both sides something they want and forcing a compromise. So when he looks at Ukraine, he doesn't see an ideological struggle. He doesn't see good versus evil. He sees a negotiation, two sides who want different things, and a United States that can leverage pressure to force a resolution. That's why a lot of his proposals read like contract restructuring rather than diplomatic policy. 4. Domestic politics. Trump wants a win. Let's be real. Ending the Ukraine war, or even appearing to move toward ending it, would be a massive political victory for Trump. He can say, "War ended on my watch. I brought American troops home. I saved the U.S. billions of dollars. Democrats dragged this out. I wrapped it up in months." That's powerful messaging. And politically, the simplicity of it matters. It doesn't matter if experts say the plan is unrealistic or flawed. Trump's brand has always been about big, bold announcements first and details later. 5. Trump believes Putin responds to strength. End a deal. Trump has often argued that Putin is a rational actor. Russia wants respect. Russia wants security guarantees. And a strong American president can negotiate from a position of leverage. In his mind, this plan creates leverage. Pressure on Ukraine, pressure on Russia, pressure on Europe, pressure on Congress, pressure on everyone involved, and out of that pressure, Trump hopes a deal emerges. Now we get to the most important part. Let's imagine, purely hypothetically, that the Trump administration actually succeeded in pushing this plan through. Ukraine agrees. Russia agrees. Congress doesn't block it. The international community grudgingly accepts it. What happens then? Well, the consequences would be huge. Let's go through the major ones. 1. Ukraine's sovereignty takes a massive hit. Ukraine would lose territory, population, resources, strategic depth. But, even more importantly, it would lose the principle that its borders are not negotiable. That's devastating, because once a country gives up land to an invader under pressure, the message is clear. Our borders are flexible. 2. The U.S. encourages future aggression, not just from Russia. If this deal were to pass, authoritarian states around the world would take notes, and those notes would say something like, if you invade and hold out long enough, you'll eventually get rewarded. The U.S. will push the weaker country to compromise. You might lose soldiers, but you'll gain land. That's a dangerous lesson. Countries like China, Iran, North Korea, and yes, Russia again, would absolutely internalize it. And what do you think happens next? The world becomes more unstable, because aggression now has a proven payoff. 3. Russia's appetite for future invasions would grow. This one's obvious. If Russia walks away with Ukrainian land, they don't stop there. Why would they? They just prove the West has limits, and those limits can be exploited. The Baltics know this. Poland knows this. Finland knows this. That's why they're terrified. A Russia that wins in Ukraine becomes a Russia that starts thinking, maybe we can push a little further. And that's how wars start. 4. America's global leadership takes a major hit. This is huge. For decades, America's credibility rested on a simple idea. The U.S. supports its allies. The U.S. defends the rules-based international order. The U.S. doesn't reward aggression. If this plan goes through, that perception cracks, maybe permanently. Allies would lose trust. Rivals would lose fear. Neutral nations would rethink their alignment. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan would start asking, if America can abandon Ukraine under pressure, will they abandon us too? That's the kind of doubt that changes global alliances. 5. Europe may launch a new arms race. If America steps back, Europe steps up, because it has no choice. You'd likely see huge increases in military spending, new defense partnerships, accelerated missile defenses, more troops on NATO's eastern flank, and possibly even nuclear discussions in countries like Poland or Germany. And guess what? Russia would respond, and we're suddenly back in a Cold War environment, but more unstable, more unpredictable, and with less American involvement. 6. The U.S.-China strategic balance shifts. China watches everything America does with a magnifying glass, and if Washington signals that it's willing to trade away a partner's territory for peace, Beijing interprets that as America is tired, America is stretched thin, America will compromise. That changes the Taiwan calculus dramatically, and it emboldens China in ways that could reshape the Asia-Pacific region for decades. 7. The rules-based world order weakens. Since World War II, the world operated on a simple rule: you cannot take land by force. The U.S. didn't invent that rule, but it enforced it. If Trump's plan legitimizes Russia's territorial gains, that rule collapses. And once that rule collapses, the world gets more dangerous, more chaotic, and more unpredictable. Here's where things get interesting. If you know Trump's negotiating style, and I mean really understand it, you know one thing. He always starts with the most extreme ask possible. This is classic Trump. Start with the maximum demand, shock everyone, establish the negotiation on your terms, then back down slightly and claim victory. It's the ask for the moon, so settling for the clouds looks reasonable strategy. He's done it in business. He's done it in politics, and he's doing it again here. So when Trump drops a 28-point plan with impossible demands and a 1-week deadline, it's not because he expects the world to obey instantly. It's because he's setting the stage. Here's likely what he's aiming for: create pressure, frame himself as the only one pushing for peace, force Ukraine and Europe to react, shake up the diplomatic status quo, then negotiate down from the extreme position. And in the end, he can soften some points, extend deadlines, remove a few controversial requirements, and claim, look, I'm flexible, I'm reasonable, I'm making progress. It's classic anchoring. It's classic deal-making. It's classic Trump. Whether you agree with it or not, the strategy is unmistakable. And that's why we shouldn't be surprised if, in a few days or weeks, Trump says, okay, we'll extend the deadline, or maybe Ukraine doesn't have to give up that much territory, or we're open to revising some of the 28 points, because the original proposal isn't the real goal. The real goal is leverage. So, to sum this all up, Trump's 28-point plan sent shockwaves around the world because it wasn't just a proposal. It was a message, a signal that the U.S. might fundamentally reshape its role in global politics. The reactions were intense because the stakes are enormous: Ukraine's survival, Russia's future ambitions, Europe's security, America's global leadership, and the future of the international order. Whether this plan actually goes anywhere is still unclear. Congress may block it, Ukraine may refuse, Europe may push back hard, but one thing is certain. This proposal has already changed the conversation, and probably on purpose. Because at the end of the day, Trump is a negotiator. He starts big, loud, and extreme. He tests reactions. He watches who blinks. And then, maybe, he adjusts. So don't be surprised if the 1-week deadline becomes 2 weeks or a month. And don't be surprised if the 28 points become 20 or 15 or 10. Because with Trump, the first offer is never the final offer.